Okay, hi everybody. Here we are in week two of the psychological testing and assessment course. Um, I am going to start by doing something I said I was going to do towards the end of last week, and I didn't do it yet. I have here the thematic apperception test. So I am going to show you the cards. I know you have the slides that have the cards on them, but I'm going to uh, just give you sort of a view of what the test looks like. Um, and so, and then you have the way it's administered. Um, Here is the first card, card number one. That's what it looks like. Card, card number two. Card number three. Card number four. Number five. Actually, no, the numbers are off there, but um, as you know from reading the book, they each are, some of them are, so this is actually card number five. The one before this was actually card um, 3GF. Some of them were listed as being, when they were developed, some were listed as being better for women, and some were listed as being better for men. That, of course, since has uh, not been the way the test is viewed, but they kept the numbering system. Um, Here's the next card. Next card. I'm just going through it because I know, and we'll talk more about them, but I wanted you to at least have a view of what this whole test looks like. Okay. This one is sort of often seen as a card that reflects an individual's feeling towards medical health and possibly medical difficulties because there's surgery going on in the background. This card is oftentimes difficult to figure out. Um, Trying to get a good. This is a card that's often difficult to figure out how you present it. I'll just go quickly because there's actually quite a few other ones left. I don't think I've ever given the entire set of cards. Usually select just several of them. I'm not saying too much because I don't want you to get, I mean, kind of, I don't want to, I mean, each one has its own set of interpretations that you can make. And I don't want to sort of, lead you on as to what the interpretation should be. That one's kind of spooky. Oh. Trying to get the best lighting here. And then the final card is the one I mentioned last week. It's blank. Okay, so that's just a collection of what all the cards look like. Okay, now as we start this week, we're going to focus a lot on projective, and next week we'll talk a little bit. We'll talk more about subjective tests. I'm sorry, no, objective tests. Um, I wanted to start um, the the idea of projective tests has been around for um, well since really the beginning of psychotherapy. Freud used to use word association, which is I give you a word, you tell me the first word that comes to your mind. Um, that really is a projective test. And I'll talk a little bit more about what um, distinguishes a projective test. Um, but then the other ones developed. The Rorschach developed later, and then after that, the thematic apperception test. Um, I have here a book called The Analysis of Fantasy. It was written by William Murray in 1958. And to me, it's one of the it's actually it's called The Analysis of Fantasy, and it's actually subtitled The Thematic Apperception Technique in the Study of Personality. So it actually uh, was sort of the precursor to the development of the thematic apperception test. This talks about the technique by which um, response to pictures are used as a projective technique. Um, the thing that came later was that particular set of pictures. The idea of a thematic apperception technique had been around longer than those particular pictures had been around. They were just the ones that were developed as sort of the standard set of pictures to use with the thematic apperception technique. But the thematic apperception technique had actually been around for longer than the pictures. Well, actually, um, variations of those pictures had been around, but later on, they were formalized to be uh, the primary set of stimuli that were used. But the reason I was bringing this up is I want to go through. I have not seen a better explanation of how a projective technique is supposed to be used, or an explanation of why it is used and what the process is supposed to be for, than I have in the opening paragraph of this book. So I wanted to read the paragraph to you. I'm going to read it sentence by sentence and then have sort of some comments after each sentence. So let me start with the analysis of fantasy is a problem in the interpretation of symbolic statements. The analysis of fantasy is a problem in the interpretation of symbolic statements. So the idea is that um, we express our emotional experiences, our fantasies, our desires through symbolic gestures, and we'll go into more about how that works as this paragraph goes on. When in story form, so notice how the pictures are the stimuli by which the interpreted material is um, expressed. But the material that's actually being interpreted are the stories. The pictures are the trigger, but the stories are the useful material. It's like with the Rorschach and the ink blot test. It's called the ink blot test, but really the ink blots are only the um, the trigger for themes that are coming out and how the person described it. So if you think about it, the thematic apperception test is a much more accurate reflection of what a projective test is looking for, because what you're looking for are the themes, the meat of a projective test are the themes that are evident in the stories or the descriptions that the person gives. So calling the Rorschach ink blot test can be a little bit misleading, because ink blots are only there to trigger the verbal material that includes the themes, the stories, that sort of thing. When in story form, these statements are organized by the intellect, but take their meaning from the emotions. That right there is probably one of the most direct statements of why we bother with projective tests you're going to find. When in story form, those statements are organized by the intellect, but take their meaning from the emotions. So it's the emotional material going through the brain, and the brain is taking that and processing it into some sort of story form. The interpretive significance of themes perceived and stories told to pictures is thus to be derived from the understanding of the ways in which emotional preoccupations are symbolized in words and plots. Of all those things, the key words are emotional preoccupations, symbolized, words, and plots. The words and plots come out, and they are a symbolic representation of emotional preoccupation. So the theory is that sort of the themes that come across throughout uh, the stories told to those pictures um, represent the emotional preoccupation that the person carries with them. Um, okay, some other things. So emotional preoccupations are symbolized in words and plots, and there's more to that sentence. From the ways in which emotions bow to propriety in overt expression. So the words and the plots that the person uses gives um, gives indication of emotional preoccupation, so does sort of the opposite. The material that the person gives in response to the pictures um, are meaningful. The words they give, but um, what also can be interpreted, basically, this is a way of saying what also can be interpreted is what the person does not say or what the person ignores. Good example of I don't have the cards right in front of me, but you'll remember that when I showed you the cards, there was one with a boy, a light, and surgery in the background. If you are um, giving that test to someone and they totally ignore in their story the surgery in the background or talk about it in a way suggesting that they don't really know what that is or are not paying attention to it or are trying to ignore it, then that's interpretable as well. So sometimes that's what's meant by propriety. Sometimes what you see is the degree to which someone will try to control what they say, um, and um, will, like it says, bow to propriety, sort of keep themselves from saying something that is triggered as an emotional preoccupation, but they are not wanting to say it because for whatever reason they don't feel it's appropriate to say it or they don't want to get across. So that second part, so the stories and the words that the person uses, the themes that come out are interpretable. What also is interpretable is what the person does not say or what they seem to ignore um, from from the picture. Okay, and then the last part of the sentence, the emotional preoccupations are symbolized words and plot, ways in which emotions bow to propriety, and from the way in which each individual lessens his own burden by expressing his feelings, though disguising them for um, himself and for others. So that's sort of another way of saying that, the specific words that the person uses, the stories that they tell are interpretable. The way they may ignore things or basically what else is interpretable is what the person does not say. And also how they express emotions, how they identify emotions, how the emotions come out in what they describe is also um, is also interpretable. And then I want to go through another part of the next paragraph. The technique of thematic apperception takes much of its particular relevance to the study of personality from the dual aspect of fantasy expression. And that's what I want to get into. So sort of the idea of a lot of projective tests, the thematic apperception test being one, is that there is a two different ways that fantasy can be uh, expressed. On the one hand, fantasy and storytelling derives from the less conscious and less structured aspects of the individual's personality. So the thematic apperception test is meant through the themes or through the stories that the person gives to one sort of tap into the less conscious part of the person's emotional experience. Um, on the other hand, so this is the second part of the dual aspect of fantasy expression. On the other hand, the task set for the storyteller is one that requires him to organize his fantasy into a recognizable story form and to verbalize this story for the inspection of others. So, um, uh, so there's this dual. I'm sorry, I was just real interested. Uh, there are other things, but I want to stop there. So there's this dual aspect to fantasy expression as it comes across in the TAT. One is um, the less logical, um, unconscious uh, parts of emotion. And then there is the way that the person organizes their emotional experience in a logical way. So emotions meet up with logic, and you get a, which is, if you think about it, one of the reasons it's relevant is that's how we all, or at least most of us, live our lives. Emotions come up against logic, and we have to um, organize our functions so that we're not responding entirely on an emotional level. Um, so the projective tests like the TAT are basically giving us a glimpse into how the person lives um, their lives in the way most of us have to live it, which is, how do we organize our emotional expression in a way that um, in a way that organizes the emotional experience through logic. Okay, so what all that is a way of reflecting what uh, the thematic apperception test in general, but also in general, or also in a very general way, how projective tests work, which is that it's a way of us getting a chance to see how the person organizes their internal world. So they respond to the external world, they respond to triggers, stimuli in the external world. It triggers in them on emotional experiences. And then um, those emotional experiences have to be regulated through the logical part of our person. And if you notice, and I guess I would say this is one of the reasons why I like the thematic apperception test a little bit better than the Rorschach is, despite the fact that those pictures in the thematic apperception test are mostly vague. In fact, some of them aren't exactly clear what's there. There's more clarity, at least in what sort of emotional experience you would expect. There's the sort of creepy one with the guy all the angles and clearly in a graveyard. There's the kid with the surgery in the background. Um, there's clearly one where there's some sort of sexual tension between the individuals in the picture. There's a lot of them having to do with loneliness. There's one in particular that you may notice there with just seems to be a man sitting on a window and everything else is black. So he just seems to be sitting alone in the darkness. So you can sort of see that the stimuli have a degree of emotional feel to them, even though exactly what's going on in the picture is not there. So almost just from looking at the picture, you can see that there's already sort of an emotional environment to it but it's not spelling it out, like why that emotional. But so you can sort of see that what each card does is trigger some sort of emotional response. There's not a whole lot of happy pictures in there, um, but you can see sort of what each one of them is going for, at least as far as general emotional feel. And then what happens is, well, how does the person respond to that? So, and that's sort of the part about, when I was talking about when I was reading that first paragraph, that's a degree to which you get this part where, you know, what's interpretable is how the person gets out the emotional experience. If we go back to the one with the surgery in the background, the person laughs when they're given their response. You can have some sort of sense that they're blocking something. You know, there's a lot of feelings that come out there. I don't know that laughter would be one of them. Okay, let me talk a little bit about projective tests, just general material about projective tests. Let's start with just a general description of how objective and projective tests differ. Um, with objective tests, um, the there's a universal standard for what the responses mean. Norms, for example, there's a universal. When we get to the MMPI, we will talk about normative data. So there's data that shows what the standard is for how results on the MMPI-2 are to be interpreted. That's an objective test. A projective test um, is the responses, each set of responses are analyzed for meaning. The meaning isn't presupposed before the person gives their answers. You sort of so when you start off with when you have the MMPI-2, you've already decided what certain responses mean. In projective tests, you're sort of going the opposite way. You get the responses first and then you analyze them for meaning. Now, what there is a standard of is how to, the process by which you interpret that meaning. So there's a process in terms of what you're looking for, what sort of responses stand out, how to identify when the person's like, um, skipping over something or denying something or repressing something. So all of those are there, but you start with the responses and then analyze them using a certain process. With objective tests, you've already decided what certain types of responses are. You're just looking for where this individual's responses falls. What sort of responses are they going to give you? A projective test is basically described as a personality test that lets a person respond to ambiguous stimuli and presumably revealing hidden emotions and internal conflicts. So, and so key points there: ambiguous stimuli, revealing hidden emotions, and internal conflicts. It is projective tests are meant to um okay, and these are some things we talked about before, um but so the ambiguous stimuli, revealing hidden emotions, internal conflicts. um the projective tests are designed to give elicit individual responses that have less conscious control. And that's where the ambiguous stimuli comes in, because the idea is that because the stimuli are ambiguous, the person has less conscious control over their responses, in part because it's hard to interpret exactly what would be expected. And you could tell in when I showed you the TAT cards, you could, the one I pointed out with the man in the graveyard, um, you could tell where this idea of less conscious control comes from and why it becomes anxiety provoking and difficult, because it would be hard if you were trying to come across positive, if you were trying to fake your response. How would you do it with that card? You couldn't just you it's like, if you were taking the Beck depression inventory, which we talked about before, as an objective test, it's very symptom specific, has a lot of face validity. The questions on there clearly are geared towards assessing depression. If you were taking that and you didn't want to appear depressed, you could fake it. You would know what sort of answer to give to either look depressed if you wanted to fake that you were depressed, or look not depressed if you wanted to fake that you weren't depressed. But it's hard. That card is an example of how it's hard to determine what the response should be, because you got to say something. If you're trying to fake how you look, you can't look at that card and say, well, I'm just going to say everything's great. Clearly, that card is not meant to elicit a feeling that everything's great, or that everything has a positive spin on it. So it's hard to. One of the reasons why conscious control is difficult, and why emotional responses can be triggered, is because covering up what you're really feeling or what you're really thinking when you see some of those cards is hard to do, because it's hard to know what the card is pulling for. Okay, so ambiguous stimuli, hidden emotions, internal conflicts are what are identified, individual responses with less conscious control. The interpretation is less structured than objective tests, and usually relies on a subjective evaluation of the responses. In other words, a trained psychologist is the one who interprets it, and it needs to be someone with that training, because the interpretation relies on the subjective uh, conclusions of the individual doing the interpretation. You can get a computer to score the MMPI too, and that's, as I was talking about before. I mean, there's a lot of computer scoring and interpretive programs for the MMPI too. You can't really do that with a projective test. It's up to the psychologist to use their own skills and training and understanding of human psychology to decide what the responses likely mean. Other things about projective tests, they are less dependent on the subject's willingness or ability to give personal information. Subjects are unaware of the purpose of the test and are usually unable to judge how particular responses are interpreted. Um, there are two uh, there are different types of projective tests, and the specific type is based on the type of task that is involved. So the stimuli of projective tests are ambiguous, but they all involve different types of tasks. And the type of projective test is based on the type of task. Um, the association technique, that's the first type of projective test, involves the subjects telling what is suggested by a verbal, visual, or auditory stimuli. Word association is the earliest projective test, and that was considered an association technique, where the person is given a word and asked to tell what association is suggested by that word, what association they make to that word. The Rorschach is also an association technique. Uh, the person is to uh, tell uh, what sort of association they is triggered when shown an ink blot. Association technique. Construction technique involves the creation of an imaginal production for which the test materials provide a framework. So what this means is um, the person produces a story, produces an imagination or an imaginative um, product based on the pictures that they are shown. The TAT is an example of a construction technique. Completion technique. This is a type of projective test where the subject is required to complete a statement or a story. These are considered more structured. Um, and the sentence completion technique is um, the sentence completion technique is considered to be a completion, or the sentence completion test is considered a completion technique. Choice or ordering technique um, is it's almost like the TAT with no, it's a nonverbal version of the TAT. The person is given a series of pictures um, and they put them in order to tell a story. But there's a couple things about it. One is they're not actually asked to tell a story. In other words, there is no verbal part to it. They just put the pictures in order and say there's the story. Um, and it like so there's no verbal part to it. And the person takes the pictures and puts them in whatever order they think tells a story. Um, this is called one of the example of the choice or ordering technique. It's called the picture arrangement test. And then the final type of projective test is the expressive technique. This is where projective test almost overlaps with with um, art therapy because there is no test stimuli in expressive techniques. The subject is asked to perform an artistic or creative activity. The house tree person test that we talked about last week. Um, the house tree person technique that we talked about last week is an example of that sort of test. Okay. So going back to let's talk a little bit about the theoretical basis of these tests. Um, Basically, as you can tell, they have their origins in psychoanalytic psychology, particularly the theories that stress that humans have conscious and unconscious attitudes and motivations that are beyond or hidden from their conscious awareness. So, um, notice how the words conscious and unconscious are used because it's not, one of the things that's useful to keep in mind when we talk about psychoanalytic psychology is one issue that came up pretty soon after Freud started writing and then became an issue throughout the history of psychoanalytic psychology continuing today was this question of um, how unconscious or unconscious motivations and attitudes and drives. Is it necessarily the case that they are completely hidden from our awareness, or are they more pushed down? So, are they things that the person doesn't even admit to themselves, or are they things that um, are they things that um, the person admits but then immediately pushes back? It's interesting that one thing that happened, in recent decades, psychoanalytic psychology has sort of met with neurology, neuroscience, and there's been a lot of evidence for unconscious processes. But it's interesting that in the neurological literature, they call it non-conscious as opposed to unconscious or subconscious. The idea that, you um, classic psychoanalytic theory had conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. And a lot of theories now, from a neurological perspective, that address psychoanalytic, psychodynamic concepts use the term non conscious. So, sort of grouping together these things um, that are not in our immediate awareness, but sort of not necessarily grouping them as to whether they are totally aware out of the person's awareness, like they are repressed just entirely, or whether they are more just under the surface. Um, Here is a statement from Lawrence Frank from 1939, that is a summary of the theory underlying the process of projective height. So this is sort of seen as the key introductory statement of projective testing and the whole purpose of it. And it's from 1939. When people try to understand vague or ambiguous, unstructured stimuli, the interpretation they produce reflects their needs, feelings, experience, prior conditioning, thought processes. So basically, notice how that's summarized: vague, ambiguous, unstructured stimuli, that makes up the projective test, and what it, um, and interpretation, that's the process that gives the answer to what does this data mean? So the psychologist interprets the results, and that interpretation reflects the subject's needs, feelings, experience, experience, prior conditioning, thought processes. Um, okay. Sort of the idea behind um, the need for these ambiguous and unstructured stimuli is that if the person is asked a specific question, the response they give will be totally conscious, formulated, and socially determined. So the answer to the question doesn't necessarily reflect anything other than what the person wants to reveal. Um, the and in terms of why the material may be non-conscious or unconscious, it may be because um, the person may be um, fighting off conscious awareness of it. So their psychological process may be what's keeping them from being psychologically conscious of what they are feeling, or they may not be able to express it. They may know something's there, and may not even be hiding anything, but can't quite figure out how to effectively express it. What is seen as key in a projective test is the ambiguity of the stimuli. Allows the subjects to express thoughts that originate on a deeper level. So because the material that is um, meant to trigger um, the response, because it's ambiguous about what the person's looking for and what's expected in the response, it tends to trigger less conscious material. Um, and that's why you get the non-conscious material. Let's talk about validity of projective tests. We will talk more about validity as we talk more about test development. Validity is essentially the word that is used to describe how well the test measures what it is supposed to measure. Evidence for validity in most projective tests is rather modest. Um, there aren't many projective tests that have very high validity as far as the typical measures of validity. It's like I said last class, there's almost universal acceptance that responses to ambiguous stimuli, like the TAT, like the Rorschach, means something. But exactly what it means is um, is uh, is not accepted. There is I will also admit there is a degree to which professional pride and professional um, awareness, professional commitment enters into this, because the general understanding of projective test is the general understanding of test is um, anybody can interpret the MMPI-2. You can do it by computer. You know, you're not allowed to buy it unless you have a license, but it's pretty well accepted that um, you could get an interpretation, you could administer it and get an interpretation without having any particular training. But projective tests take training. You have to be a well experienced psychologist in order to properly interpret a Rorschach or a TAT. Now, I would argue also my standing is, uh, and I would this would be my point of view of this. My standing would be that you also have to be a trained um, psychologist in order. You really should be a trained psychologist before you interpret the MMPI two. I'm not a strong believer that you should go with just the computer interpretation. I I I use computer interpretation, um, but I think you should know where the results are coming from. You should know um, how it's interpreted, um, rather than just um, uh, go by what the computer tells you. And I know in court you have to. You know, if you ever use an MMPI two and you are confronted in court about it, you can't say, "Well, I drew this conclusion because the computer told me to." You actually have to know um, what it is, where the results came from. Okay, so uh, that's the general gist of um, projective tests, how they work. We can talk about. I thought maybe for a second here, I pulled up on my on the material I have here. I pulled up we talked about one of it was one completion test that's a projective test is the sentence completion test. And the original sentence completion test was developed by Joseph Sachs. And I just, it was designed to have four major areas that that was meant to test: family issues, sexual attitudes, interpersonal relationships, and self concepts. And I thought just um, uh, some of the items that are on the sentence completion. Um, my mother and I blank. My family threatens me like blank. I think most girls blank. I wish I could lose the fear of blank. My greatest mistake was blank. I believe I have the ability to blank. What I want most out of life blank. So you can see it's I mean it's interesting, and it can be a useful test, but it's kind of like I said, it's got face validity. It's kind of obvious what the person's looking for. Those four areas, you can even tell in those four areas, the items I read there, which area the items probably relate to. Okay, that's a good amount for now, and I'll look forward to seeing everybody Thursday when we'll pick this up. See you then.